Many of the things in Robbins chapter 18 are a little bit outdated now, but her section about responsive design remains a good, solid introduction to this very important topic. So some of your decisions about responsiveness are going to depend on how your app or your site is laid out, like how you design the rectangle, the page. In other words, you can't learn one single solution for responsive and then apply it to all apps and sites. That's not going to work. At your early stage in learning, you can't really absorb everything there is to know about responsive design. A lot is going to come to you with practice as you solve problems. In this video, I want to demonstrate two basic techniques for making your sites work better on smaller devices as well as bigger devices, and also show you what the consequences are if you don't use these techniques. You're going to learn more about media queries when we learn Bootstrap, a responsive framework, which will be later in this course. In an earlier video connected to chapter 15, you saw how to create a fluid layout. And fluid layouts are related to using media queries, so we'll talk about that a little bit, but mainly we'll be covering that later along with Bootstrap. So I'm going to use this pretty simple page, looks familiar, right? To demonstrate how we can add some responsive techniques to make this page respond well to a smaller device size. So in other words, it's going to look nice when we try to look at it on a phone. So that you can get an overview of the page, right? It's got a heading, a paragraph, then it's got a photo, little caption, paragraph, photo, another little caption, third paragraph, a little link at the end. The white box is a div with the ID of container. The background is a light blue color. Let's look at our HTML, right? So very normal looking stuff. Here's the div that makes the white box around everything, and that div ends at the bottom like you would expect, right? So there's nothing special in the HTML at all so far, and there's nothing special in the CSS so far. So what we'll see when we open this page on a phone, it's tiny. The text is very tiny. The box, the white box around the content, it doesn't look good. This page doesn't adjust at all for the smaller size of the mobile screen. So what can we do with that? The first and easiest addition we can make to make the page more responsive is to add the Viewport Meta Tag. And this tag has to go into the head. So let's go into our text editor, and the meta char set tag always has to be the first thing in the head. It has to be at the top. So the Viewport Meta Tag can come after that. It can be the second thing. And I've got that copied, so I'm going to paste it in. And this is exactly like the code you just saw. And I'm also going to change the heading so that we know which version we're looking at. So I'm going to change that 1 to a 2 and save and reload. And other than that number 2, we don't see any change at all when the screen is wide. But watch what happens when we open this on the phone. Now this definitely does not look pretty, but the one change that it made that's really good is that now the text is a readable size. What the Viewport Meta Tag does is it adapts the page as much as is possible to the ratio and size of the device that it's on. Now, in this case, this page has some other things going on that don't make it work so well. So let's address those next. So the only thing that we're going to change, and the only thing we have changed in the HTML file, is we added the Viewport Meta Tag at the correct place within the head of the document. And I'm also going to change my H1 here to say the number 3 so that when we load it, we know that we're looking at something new. But the additional changes that we need to make to make this page more responsive, we'll have to do in the CSS. And the first thing we're going to address is those images that were much too wide. Even though the container div that was white got really narrow, the images didn't change size at all. They just stayed their whole full size. Changing that is one of the simplest things we can do. I'm going to do it right here after the body. And Robbins talks about this in the book. This is ridiculously easy. We give all images a max width of 100%. This means that they will never be wider than whatever contains them. So whether that container is the size of the device or the container div or some other kind of wrapper or tag-like article, the image will not spill outside of that to the left or the right. And so by saying max width, we're saying you cannot be any wider than the width that you are, and you cannot be any wider than the width of the thing you are in. We're saying that to all the images. Now, if we had specified some image properties further down on this page, we would actually want to take this out and put it at the bottom after all those other things. But I don't have any other image properties here, so we're going to put it right at the top where you can see it. So we'll save that. We see the 3 and nothing any different there. What about if I just grab this browser edge and move it over? Will we see any change? Not yet. And why not? What's happening to the div itself? It's not changing either. So our photo is behaving exactly the way it should. It's filling up the div. That leads us to our next change, which is my container has a set width on it of 640 pixels. I'm going to tell that to be a max width also. And max width has a hyphen, must have that hyphen. So when I save and reload, now you're going to see a difference when I change the size of the browser. I make it narrower, and what's happening? Whoa. That's what you want to see. Now, I'm seeing that I also have a problem with my big wide margin, top right, bottom left, around the outside of my white box. That's not looking so great as this window gets narrower and narrower, right? But the photos are behaving beautifully. And what about the other photo? Also behaving very nicely, right? It has an equal space on the left and the right. And let's go all the way down. Right? But that white box is getting uglier and uglier the smaller we get. So that'll be the next thing we'll fix. So my mission now requires that we use the @media queries. And those are a little tricky. They have a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of ways to use them. But all I need to do with this page to make it adapt nicely for mobile is that when the screen gets too narrow, I need to get rid of the margin on the body. That's what's making the blue edges outside the white container. And also there's a very thin border on my white container, and I want to get rid of that at the same time. So when the screen gets too narrow, I want to get rid of those two things. So I will do that in my CSS. I will put my media queries at the bottom, which is usually where we find them. So they begin with @media, and then we're going to have parentheses that give what kind of parameters are we going to constrain this by. And I'm going to make this really simple and just do one. I'm going to say max width, and this decision about what is the width at which the page is going to look different. Robbins talks about how usually we put in 2 breakpoints, one for tablets and one that's smaller for mobile phones, mobile devices that are small. I'm only going to put in one to make this simple, all right? But usually we would put two declarations like this, one for the tablet size, one for the mobile phone size. And we wouldn't put one for every single device there is. That would be too many. We usually pick one small one and one medium one. I'm going to kind of go in the middle of small and medium and say 600 pixels. Now, following this, what is this? This is our selector, I guess, the at media query anyway. You need to have your curly braces. And then in here, you are going to put the complete declaration for any selector that you want to change. So you're going to have the selector name, and then you're going to have, well, which properties are going to change. So just like I would type it in my normal CSS document, I'm going to type, I want the body selector to have a difference, okay? And then what property do I want to change? I want the margin on all four sides, top, right, bottom, and left, to be 0. And don't forget your semicolon. That takes care of the blue border outside the white box that's making the white box too narrow, right? That just gets rid of that blue outside altogether. Now below that, we also want to do another thing that I mentioned. We want to get rid of the border on the white box, because if the white box now goes from side to side and top to bottom, we don't need to see any border on it. So what is that on? That is on our container div. Oops, and I've forgotten, is container a class or an ID? It is an ID, so it's not a dot, it's a hash mark. And what am I getting rid of? I am getting rid of the border, border width, and I will simply make that 0, and that will cancel out everything about the border, the color and everything. So my media query in this case is a pretty simple one. I'm only doing one media query, but it is going to affect two different selectors that are in my CSS above this. So for everything bigger than 600 pixels, they're going to be what they were before, but anything 600 pixels or less, it's going to be affected by this new body margin and this new container border width. So when I save that and I reload and I grab that edge again and come in, watch what happens when I get smaller, smaller. It's not 600 pixels yet, right? Smaller, 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 smaller. That was the changeover. So still more than 600 pixels, still have the blue outside from the body. When we hit 600 pixels, the blue background goes away, the border goes away, and we've already dealt with our container and our images being flexible. So when we get all the way down to making this look like a phone, I'll show you the actual phone screen in a moment, but here is the narrowed up browser window. Exactly what you want it to look like on the smaller screen. And even a slightly bigger screen, like say you had an iPad mini. There's a point at which this is okay, but then there's a smallness at which you would rather have it look like this, right? So now let's look at the phone size, and you'll see that on the phone you don't see any of the blue body color, and you don't see a border, and it looks the way you'd want to be reading this on a phone. So we've covered the basics about how you can make your own apps and sites responsive so that they look good, so they are readable and they look proper no matter what size of device the user is looking at or using to see your stuff. Although we didn't talk much about fluid layouts here, it is covered in the book, and also our example only had one column, so there wasn't much we could do with a layout. But the typical thing that happens is things in column 2, 3, and etc., they fall down below column 1 so that when you're on your phone, you can just scroll up and see everything in one straight vertical line. So that's the end of what we're going to do with chapter 18. We're going to ignore the rest of this chapter.